welcome. So tonight is our last lecture, and I don't know if I saved the best for last, but I certainly saved the most for last. In terms of the vast repertoire of Christian art, there are countless images of Mary and the saints. After Jesus, the most common figure in Christian art is Mary, and then, there's no end to the number of saints depicted in Christian art, and the different ways they're depicted, and so on. So today, we're not only going to just do Mary, which would itself be a series of lectures, but also the saints. And this gets into a number of both very interesting artistic elements, but also some of the most divisive and difficult theological issues that we've looked at so far in these lectures. Because if there's one thing that divides Christians theologically, it's the understanding of Mary and the saints and what their place is. And so one of the things that I find when looking at divisive theological issues that's helpful is to always start with history, to have some kind of common reference point that then can be a basis for conversation and for understanding. And so what I'm going to present here is a bit about the history of Marian theology, some things that are kind of just facts about the early phases of Christian theology about Mary and the saints. And then we'll move into some images. Now, for most of Christian history, the kind of images of Mary and the saints we'll see are coming from a theological trajectory that Catholics and Eastern Christians would recognize as their own. Many Protestant Christians would not be depicting Mary and the saints, not all, but many would not be depicting Mary and the saints in the first place, so it wouldn't be in their repertoire of art. And so in turning to the kind of the earliest phase as a reference point from which we'll see then different theological trends develop. The first point to start is what does the New Testament say about Mary and the saints? The first thing is, in reading the New Testament, you find out that it's very easy to be a saint in the New Testament. All you need to be is a baptized follower of Christ, and then you are a holy one, a saint. Things have gotten more difficult. It's like college entrance exams have gotten more difficult. Well, for the early Christians, it was very straightforward. If you were a follower of Christ, you were one of the holy ones. And that's actually been a theme of a lot of Christian theology, is to recover that early understanding of what does it mean to be a saint. Now, in addition to that basic characteristic, there were a number of figures that stood out. The apostles, who we looked at last time, various figures mentioned in the Gospels or Acts of the Apostles, Mary Magdalene among them, and then Mary, the mother of Jesus. And even after their deaths, in their lifetime, these figures, the apostles, were honored and respected, although even they argued with each other, didn't always fully respect each other. But even after their death, they continued to be honored by the early Christian community. In the earliest days, as far as we can tell from the historical record, which is very spotty for the first few centuries, by far the apostles are the ones most honored. But soon, in the 2nd century, other figures start to fill in, including Mary, as we'll see, and also people past the age of the apostles and Jesus, the martyrs. Those who died for their faith in some way very quickly came to a special prominence for the early Christians. So that part that's all wide agreement as this is the basis. But from then on, interpreting the limited information we have often gets interpreted through different lens. Catholics and Eastern Christians, meaning Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Coptic Christians, honor Mary and the saints in ways that most Protestant Christians do not. Most, but not all. Many Protestants also share similar views as Catholic Christians and Eastern Christians. So in the Catholic and Eastern tradition, there is a tradition not only of honoring these saints as especially worthy of honor and veneration, but also as people alive in the Lord who are asked for their prayers. They're asked to turn to God and ask for things on behalf of Christians. And Eastern and Catholic Christians will see this as very similar to asking a friend to pray for them. Only these friends are in heaven. And as in the letter to James, he says that the prayers of a holy man is powerful. And with the idea being that those in heaven, seeing God face to face, are very holy, and therefore their prayers are very powerful. These traditions also look to Mary more than just a special intercessor, but also as a spiritual mother for Christians. That just as Jesus gave John Mary as his mother at the foot of the cross, so too all Christians have that relationship. But most Protestant Christians take this very differently. They would honor Mary as the mother of Jesus and a holy woman. And likewise, they honor early Christians as holy men and women, martyrs as holy men and women. But they point out that customs of praying to saints, praying to the dead, asking for their prayers, it's not found in the New Testament. And they see these things as a corruption of Jesus' teaching, things that are strained beyond, in a typical human fashion, to turn to things that are not God and give them the honor that should only be given to God. So that's the two main trajectories that develop. Now, going back to the New Testament, the text of the New Testament, Mary appears in many places in the Gospels, especially in the story of Jesus' infancy, but also in key moments in Jesus' adult life. She's not present very often in his adult life, but when she is present, it's often at very important moments. In John's Gospel, she's present at the wedding feast of Cana when Jesus is there. In fact, from the way the story is told, it looks like Jesus was invited to this wedding because of her. And they run out of wine, and she points this out to Jesus, and he ends up performing his first miracle, turning water into wine. Mary is also one of the few friends and family of Jesus who are with him while he's being crucified. Most of them had fled, but Mary is there, we see in the Gospel of John. She also appears at a pivotal moment in the Acts of the Apostles, when the apostles and early Christians are praying after Jesus has gone to the Father, and she's mentioned by name as being with the apostles and others as the Holy Spirit descends on them at Pentecost. And then lastly, in the strangest book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, there's one point where it describes a woman clothed with the sun, a vision in the sky. And then she gives birth to a son destined to rule all the nations. And her name isn't given, but it's generally understood this is Mary and or the church being depicted here. So she doesn't overwhelm the pages of the New Testament, but she's there prominently in key moments. One moment in particular we'll see it's especially important for early Christian understanding of Mary and also for Christian art is the story of the Annunciation. This is the story when God sends the angel Gabriel to tell Mary that she's been chosen to be the mother of the Messiah. The angel Gabriel comes, tells her, this is the plan, and she says, "Let it be done to me as you have said." And the Holy Spirit overshadows her, and she becomes pregnant with Christ. And this moment is not only a very important moment in Christian art, but it was one of the moments that led to a lot of the earliest theological reflection that we have examples of about Mary. This pivotal moment where not only is Mary kind of notified of her role, but Jesus becomes flesh in her womb. So things start, for much of the Middle Ages, the new year in Europe was celebrated on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, rather than January 1st, March 25th, because this, from a Christian point of view, is when history starts fresh with the incarnation of Christ. So that's all just kind of stating what's there in the scriptures. Now, so historically, what can we say about the first few centuries? So I'll say just where this is going is, everybody knows that in 431, there is a big Christian council where the early Christians gather and officially declare that it is proper to call Mary Theotokos, the God-bearer, the mother of God. And after that point, there is a huge increase in devotion and attention to Mary. And so where Catholic and Protestant interpretations differ is, what was happening until 431? Was this suddenly kind of out of nowhere that things change? Or was there something brewing that kind of comes to this point and then develops even further? So what can we say? Here I'm going to try to be, to stick to what is commonly agreed upon as kind of historical data, and then, we'll talk about when there's disagreement. So one way to look at this thing is, how does Mary figure in early Christian theology? And Mary does not have a prominent place in early Christian theology until the 4th century. You start to see her talked about more. She's not really talked about by early Christian theologians. And when she is talked about, it's mainly in the context of how Jesus was conceived virginally, and therefore he's as a sign that he is the Son of God, and also a Son of Man, human and fully God. And then one of the kind of the seeds of an important theological idea that ends up being reflected on who Mary is in a particular way is drawing a connection between Mary and Eve. That just as Christ in Paul's letters is talked about as being a new Adam, he's like, Adam was created fresh from the hands of God and then sins. Christ is also a fresh start for humanity. And early on, Mary is seen, just as Christ is the new Adam, as a new Eve, a second Eve, a fresh start for women, just as Christ was a fresh start for men. And there's a couple passages here I won't read them all here, but one from Justin Martyr, middle of the 2nd century, where he draws a contrast between Eve, it falls to temptation and sins and disobeys God, whereas Mary, the angel comes to her and she says yes, she obeys God. So the Virgin Eve, has a chance, goes wrong. The Virgin Mary has a chance and obeys. A little after that, Irenaeus of Lyon puts it in terms of a knot. Eve ties a knot with her disobedience, and Mary, with her obedience, unties the knot. And elsewhere, Irenaeus will also call Mary the cause of our salvation, insofar as her obedience to God, when he sends the angel Gabriel, ends up opening a pathway for Christ to take flesh. And as the early Christians reflect on Mary in their theological writings, a theme ends up, just as in a few lectures ago, we spoke about how the early Christians saw types of Christ in the Old Testament. Various figures, either images, like in terms of things in the Old Testament, or persons, David, Judah, as types of Christ, somehow foreshadowing who Christ is. Well, the early Christians do this as well with Mary. They see types in the Old Testament that say something about who Mary is. The burning bush that speaks to Moses, they see this as a sign of Mary, that just as the bush is, has flames but is not consumed, so Mary is a virgin yet a mother. Her virginity is not taken away as she becomes a mother. The Ark of the Covenant, this holy object that keeps within it the Ten Commandments, the Word of God. So Mary is the Ark of the New Covenant because within herself she carries the Word of God, Christ, taken flesh. Also, figures like the sister of Moses, her name happens to be Miriam, which is ultimately what Mary is from, the Hebrew word for Mary. So they see Moses, Christ is the new Moses, so Mary is the new Miriam. There's Hannah, a woman who has difficulty conceiving and then conceives miraculously and gives birth to the prophet Samuel. So Mary gives birth miraculously to Christ. And in general, Mary's often called the chosen daughter of Jerusalem, the holy city. She's the highest honor of the human race, and particularly of Israel. So those are some of the theological themes. And one of the trends in recent scholarship about Mary has been just in the past 20, 30 years, has been to say there's been too much focus on the theology of Mary among the early Christians. Catholics would look to the early centuries and say, okay, where does some church father say something about how it's good to pray to Mary? Protestants would look for the opposite in terms of the theology. And there's not much there, especially in the early centuries. But if you shift the lens and you instead say, okay, how did early Christians in their popular culture, how did they talk about Mary, portray Mary in some of the early art that we will see? How did they pray? What evidence do we have for early Christian liturgies when they gathered for Sunday worship? What kind of feast days did they keep? What kind of things did they write telling stories about Mary? That perspective opens up a lot of different things. So when we look at it from this lens, there's more data in some ways than you'd find among what the theologians are writing. One of the most important is what's known as the Protoevangelium of James, which is a really kind of surprisingly early document, around 145 AD. The Latin means First Gospel of James. That was a title given in the 1500s, but it has no real title associated with it. And what it's all about is telling the life of Mary. It starts with telling who her parents are. They're given the name Anne and Joachim, which is why this is the only place in Christian tradition where we've got the names of Mary's parents. And various little details about Mary's life up through the birth of Jesus. Now, this text is, even among the early Christians, they had kind of mixed feelings about it. Because on the one hand, they saw it as, like for instance, the early Christians took from this document the names for Mary's parents. That's how they got brought into Christian liturgy and Christian tradition, is from this document, the names Anne and Joachim. On the other hand, there were elements of it that read more legendary or kind of like fan fiction, where people are taking characters and kind of elaborating on them. So the Eastern churches have been more positive about it. The Catholic tradition has been more kind of, skeptical of some parts of it. But in either case, the interesting thing for our purposes is that this is a document that's essentially its purpose is to praise Mary. It doesn't say anything about praying to Mary or theological beliefs about Mary, but it tells stories about Mary that presents her as specially chosen by God, as having a special role in the story of salvation, and as someone who exemplifies Christian virtues. And the literature talks, it's just kind of there. There's not a lot of other documents. It's just kind of in isolation. So, is this one of many things out there? Is this kind of an exception? There's not much to say. Then we look to, we know about liturgical celebrations in different places. We know that in Jerusalem, Alexandria, Constantinople, starting at least as early as the 300s in some of these places, there are feasts, celebrations, annual memories. They're called Memories of Mary. Were somehow brought into liturgical celebrations. Also in Egyptian prayers, in the Eucharistic prayer, remembering the Last Supper, Mary will be mentioned in these. There's also a recently discovered hymn book used by the Georgian Orthodox Church. The Georgian Christians knew about it for a while, but Western Christians don't read ancient Georgian, so it's only kind of recently been appreciated by Western scholars. And it includes hymns, many of which praise Mary for her virtues, her holiness, and also ask for her prayers. Then we also start to have stories of Mary's death in the late 3rd, 4th centuries that speak about her somehow transitioning in some way to a heavenly existence. And if any of you are interested in some of these things, I just recently come across a really interesting book by, I put it here, Stephen Shoemaker, on Mary and early Christian faith and devotion, just published a few years ago from Yale University Press. He himself, as far as I can tell, doesn't really say what his own background is, but it seems like he's from a Protestant background. And what's really helpful about this book is that he really goes out of his way to be very even-handed in how he takes both Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox scholarship. But he brings out, one of his conclusions is that this whole realm of Marian devotion, as it's been among the popular Christian audience, has really been understudied by scholars, that there's been too much focus on the theology. So one of the ways this really comes to a head is with the title of Mary as Theotokos. So starting in the early 200s, certainly by 300 at the latest, Christians start to call Mary the Theotokos, the God-bearer. In Latin, Mater Dei, the Mother of God. And this kind of grows in popularity. And we've got an early Christian prayer to Mary. We have a piece of Egyptian papyrus that dates to 250 to 300 AD. And it has the earliest known prayer to Mary written on it. And it addresses Mary by this title of Theotokos. We take refuge beneath the protection of your compassion, Theotokos. Do not disregard our prayers in troubling times, but deliver us from danger, O only pure and blessed one. So this title Theotokos is in the background. And then where all this kind of reaches ahead is in 431. Actually, a little before that. In 428, a man named Nestorius becomes the Bishop of Constantinople, the center of the Roman Empire at the time. And he was brought in as a compromise candidate. There was division in the Christian community. The bishop had died, and there was two different people wanted to be bishop. So the emperor said, let's get somebody else. So Nestorius came from outside. And early on, he caused a stir because while Theotokos was a common, at this time, a way to talk about Mary, he said it's not theologically proper to call her that because a human could not be the bearer of God, could not be the mother of God, that you could call her Christotokos because he was the bearer of the human aspect of Christ, but you couldn't call her the Theotokos. And this immediately kind of created a big stir, and a big part of it was apparently, and it's disputed exactly what the dynamics were. We've got very limited access to what exactly was the popular reception. But there's very strong reason to think that one of the big reasons this became an issue is because ordinary Christians were used to calling Mary the Mother of God, and they didn't like being told not to. And then bishops got divided against bishops. The emperor at first sided with Nestorius, but the emperor's sister apparently liked calling Mary Theotokos. And so the bishops were gathered and summoned by the emperor to go work this out in a council. And when you hear where they meet, you already know where it's going. Because, you could pick anywhere to have this council. So where do they meet? They meet in the city of Ephesus, which was known for having especially strong devotion to Mary. There's stories which are disputed that that's where Mary and John ended up going after Jesus' resurrection. And in fact, there was already a church there dedicated to Mary, possibly Mary the Theotokos. So you've got a council meeting in a church dedicated to Mary to discuss, is it proper to call Mary the Theotokos? And you know how it's going to end. And from then on, Mary's called the Theotokos, and it's settled. It's a settled issue. And even more, it becomes imperial policy. This is now something the Roman emperor has gone behind. And so from this point on, there is an explosion. You have churches dedicated. One of the things we'll be looking at is a church in Rome that was dedicated to Mary as a result of this council. Okay, so that's the background. Background to now go to look at some of the earliest images we have. So this is one of the candidates for the earliest image of Mary. This is from the catacombs. So here you've got Mary with Jesus and a prophet, perhaps the prophet Isaiah, a virgin will conceive, perhaps a prophet Balaam from the Old Testament who talks about a star arising from Jacob and Israel. This is a star people are agreed he's pointing to. So this dates to perhaps late 200s in Rome. This is another image of Mary and Jesus from probably a little bit later, but same rough period. And Mary has her hands out in the orant position of prayer. This is another candidate for the earliest depiction of Mary, and this is just in the past several years has this been considered as a possibility. This image is from the Church of Dura Europos, which we looked at before in other contexts. And for about a century, since this has been really looked at and studied, this was thought to be an image of the Samaritan woman at the well, putting a bucket into the well to get water. But recently, a scholar has made a very strong case, which many people think he might just be right about this, that this is not the Samaritan woman at the well, this is Mary at the Annunciation. Now you say, why? She's getting a bucket. If you've seen images of Mary, the Annunciation, she's in a house, she's outside in some beautiful place, and the angel comes. Well, that Protoevangelium of James I talked about, which dates to 145 AD, in it, the story of the Annunciation is Mary's out getting water. And while she's out getting water, the angel comes to tell her that she's going to be the mother of God. And so here, this is a later depiction that is depicting the way the Protoevangelium describes. I think this is about 1000 Byzantine image from a manuscript. So there's Mary getting water, and the angel Gabriel is coming. An alternative view of the Annunciation, which didn't really become popular. So for that reason, this image dates to around 220, 230. That there's a good chance that this is the earliest depiction of Mary. And rather than being, a mother and child, it's the Annunciation. And it's one of the reasons why they think it's, one of the arguments for why it's Mary, not the Samaritan woman, is because in the early Christian art, when you have the Samaritan woman, she's almost always talking with Jesus. But there's no Jesus. There's apparently, and I can't see it, there is a little bit of movement or some etching. Part of the wall where this is destroyed. But there's reason to think there was something over here, as though she's looking at it, or it's jolting her. So this is another very early depiction of Mary. This is, I think, it's either late 200s or 300s. So there was a a Roman art form of gold glass. You'd get 2 layers of glass and you put something gold in between. It's commonly used for Roman art and also starts to be used for Christian art. So here you've got, and they could be used as grave markers. They've been found in a lot of catacombs. So here, this seems to go back originally to a catacomb. And you have Mary in the middle with her hands out in that prayer position, and Peter and Paul to the side. And the reason why we know is because their names are written. Petrus, Maria, Paulus. But one of the most common themes in the early depictions of Mary is the Magi coming to present their gifts. So here you've got Mary with the catacombs with Jesus in her lap and the three wise men. And the wise men are depicted with the distinctive cap that Phrygian Magi, a particular region, would have been wearing. So it's very clearly meant to be the wise men. And a particular widespread opinion among the early Christians of where exactly these wise men were coming from. Here's another depiction. Here, this is a very early depiction of Mary. It's another one of the earliest ones. This is from a sarcophagus. And here it says Severa. This was the woman buried there, Severa. In Dio vivas. Severa, in God may you live. And then to the side you've got the 3 Magi with their caps presenting their gifts to Mary. And there's the prophet pointing to the star, just like we saw in the catacombs, that image of the prophet pointing to a star. Could be Isaiah, could be Balaam. This is from the doors of Santa Sabina in Rome. It's where one of the earliest depictions of the crucifixion is. And another panel is this, the wise men presenting their gifts. And there may be, the depiction of Mary holding Jesus may be connected to, it's kind of like that detached from the Magi coming. But in any case, very soon, very early, this image of Mary holding the child in her lap, which would be, and as these images reflect, the story of the Magi in the Gospels, the most obvious way to read them is Jesus is 6 months to 2 years old at the time they arrive. It's not like a newborn. And in the depictions, it's not a newborn that's, depicted, a little bit older. This is just a depiction of a Phrygian Magi. So not a Christian depiction. This is a little bit of textile, a very small little strip of cloth, dates to 500s. And what I really like about it is this one of the animals leaning over the manger, the child wrapped in tightly. And then here's Mary, Jesus, and what appears to be another scene of Mary receiving the Magi. Another Mary with Jesus in her lap, again, probably to receive Magi. Okay, so now one of the most important churches and art related to Mary is the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, also known as St. Mary Major. The first basilica dedicated to Mary, built definitely in Rome, maybe the West. And it was, although there's reason to think there was something there even before the Council of Ephesus, there's a little uncertainty here, it definitely really came into its own after the Council of Ephesus in 431, where Theotokos is officially certified as an appropriate title for Mary. The front of the church was done in the, I think, 1700s. but the basic core of the inside of the building dates to the 400s. This is the back. It's built on one of the 7 hills of Rome. This is inside, so the standard basilica format of 3 main aisles with an apse in the back. Is it filled? And where the ceiling is particularly regarded, I think the Italian architect Alberti from the Renaissance period, 1400s, designed the wooden ceiling. And along the sides, you see there are mosaics along the sides. And they are the most extensive cycle of artwork related to Mary, of mosaics that we have of this earliest period. So the story of Santa Maria Maggiore has a really delightful legend associated with it, that there was this elderly Roman couple that had a lot of money, and they didn't have any children. They wanted to do something for the church. And so they have a vision, and they're told to have a church built in honor of Mary where snow falls in August in Rome, which is just a little bit more believable than snow in Hong Kong in August. And the snow falls to outline the shape of the church. So this is a medieval depiction of this, of the snow. And so there used to be a feast of Our Lady of the Snows. Various popes wanted to get rid of it because they found it kind of an embarrassing kind of story. But just people loved the story of the snow, just as a legend. And so it stayed on the Roman calendar for a while. But anyway, but it's now since been moved. And in its place, there's just simply a feast of the dedication of this church, this first church in Rome dedicated to Mary. So on the back of the church, on this arch, is a whole series of mosaics about Mary and the infancy of Jesus. There are different things leading up on the sides. We'll look at some towards the end. And these are all different scenes from the Old Testament. And there's some, at this point, we can't talk to the people who organize the mosaics, pick the subjects. But it seems to be a theme is that there are different stories from the Old Testament that talk about the ancestors of Jesus. So there's all kind of progression of stories in the background talking about, in some way, Jesus' genealogy. And then it all leads to the story of his birth in the front. And there's a particular interest in some of these of the stories from the Old Testament, not just in key figures in Jesus' genealogy, but also key woman figures who play some important role in the story of Jesus' ancestors, who were also ancestors of Jesus. So potentially both about Jesus, but also about types of Mary. It just as, there are types of Christ, also types of Mary being a theme of those mosaics. Anyway, so back to the front here. So it all terminates in this triumphal arch. And so first, looking at the left side here, it's a little scrambled the way the different scenes tell different bits of the story. But so starting at the top, we have the Annunciation. So here is Mary, depicted as an empress. She's depicted as a Roman empress, seated on a throne with angel attendants. And here's the angel Gabriel and the Holy Spirit descending. Over here is Joseph. Joseph had just come from his house over here, and it seems to be suggesting as though he's just had his dream. It's okay to take Mary as your wife. Down here, we have the wise men. So here is Mary Jesus seated on a throne, and the wise men bringing their gifts with those same little silly hats, and Joseph there in the background kind of saying hi. And now there's debate about who this woman is. And I think the strongest contender is she represents Israel. So there's Israel on one side, and Mary, his mother, and Jesus is the son of both, in a sense. Close up of those. So down here, this is Herod calling for the slaughter of the innocents. So he's sending the soldiers to kill the children. And underneath, there's a depiction of Jerusalem as a city. Seemingly, on the other side, there'll be Bethlehem, just potentially just to put out two of the most important cities for Jesus and for Israel, Jerusalem and Bethlehem. There are 6 sheep here. There'll be 6 sheep on the other side too, and they're thought to be the 12 apostles. So now we're going to the right side over here. So first, in the middle, this is Sixtus III was the Pope in the 400s who had this church built. Or it seems that the church was already starting to be built and he finished it. So he got to put his name there. And in the back, we have symbols of the 4 evangelists of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Peter and Paul in the middle. Various kind of formal figures. And then on the other side, we have the presentation of Jesus in the temple. So here is Mary bringing her child 40 days after his birth. This is Simeon, or is it Joseph? Well, one of these two is Simeon, one is Joseph. I think that's Joseph, and this is Simeon. And then Anna, the prophetess. There's a little close-up. Mary, and Jesus has a little cross over his head. And then, actually, neither of them is Joseph. I think these are just people kind of paying their respects. Here is Joseph. He's being warned in an angel to go back by another way and to flee to Egypt. So this is one of the strangest of the, just kind of because it's so nothing to do with the gospel stories. The other images all stay pretty close to the gospels. So here's Mary. It's a difficult journey from Bethlehem to Egypt, but especially if you're dressed like an empress the whole way. But that apparently, is how she's depicted. And they've arrived in Egypt. And here's the part that's kind of strange is it seems that like some king or ruler in Egypt is coming out from the city to greet them, to welcome them, which is kind of an odd detail. But one of the things that makes it's fun to look at these early Christian images is that you could see why somebody would depict Mary and Jesus this way. Mary depicted as a Roman empress. But that just doesn't get followed in later Christian art. Christian art goes a different way. And then this is the 3 wise men coming to Herod, to tell him they've seen the star rise of the Messiah. That's a good question. Just to single them out. It's also interesting that only Herod gets a name. Like there's no name for Mary or Jesus. They're more important. For some reason, he gets a name. The others don't. And then underneath there's Bethlehem. So these are scenes along the way leading up, telling about the genealogy of Jesus. And this is scenes from the desert where, so in one, they're thirsty, so Moses gets water from a rock. This one, I really like here. This is the quail. They're hungry for meat, so God sends quail. So here's the quail coming for them to catch and eat. This is the story of Jericho, where they walk around 7 times, they blow their horns, the walls of Jericho come down, and then they're able to conquer it. And one of the things they do in the story is they walk around with the Ark of the Covenant. We don't have any explanation for why this particular scene is, but there's a good chance it's chosen because of the way Mary is thought of as the Ark of the Covenant. This is a scene where Rachel comes in from the fields, and just the prominence that Rachel is given is an example of how these mosaics highlight women from the Old Testament who are somehow part of Jesus' genealogy. This is Moses being adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And there's an interesting resemblance between Pharaoh's daughter and the portrayal of Mary as an empress. Okay, so that's Santa Maria Maggiore. And now we're shifting to Ravenna about 100 years later, maybe a little more, to San Apollinare Nuovo, where we have some more early Christian mosaics. And there's a theme, like in Santa Maria Maggiore, the different mosaics line up and they're telling a story as you go along. And up here on this upper register, there are small mosaics that tell the life of Jesus. We looked at some of them earlier. But in this main part, the biggest part of the mosaics in the church, is actually a big procession. So on one side, there's a procession of early Christian male figures, I think martyrs, where Saint Martin is who is a revered figure presenting a crown to Jesus on his throne, surrounded by angels. You walk along that procession, and the last scene is this. On the other side, you've got a series of women martyrs processing, carrying crowns, palms, a sign of martyrdom and victory. And then the head, the Magi, and then Mary on the throne, surrounded by 4 angels in counterpart to Jesus, with Jesus on her lap. So this is, now we're a few hundred years after some of those early depictions of the Magi, but we see how it remains a theme, but they're starting to develop more and more attention to just not so much the Magi, but to what they're processing to. Mary seated with Jesus on her lap. So we'll pause there and pick up in 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll resume here. And so one of the themes to look at now is how Mary has been depicted as a new Eve. And there's a medieval manuscript of, I think, the Gospels, or maybe it was a prayer book. And so here, these are facing pages. You open it up, and over here you've got the story of Adam and Eve. Here's Eve getting the apple, handing it to Adam, God the Father punishing them. They're sent out of paradise by the angel. And then on the other side, you have the Annunciation. And, when reflecting on this theme of New Eve, you see why they're there. This is not an accident. These are on facing pages. Because this is the knot, as Irenaeus says, this is the knot that Eve tied. And there is Mary untying the knot on the other side. This is another different style, but the same basic idea. You open it up. On one side, you've got Adam and Eve. On the other side, you've got Mary and the angel Gabriel. This is Fra Angelico, Renaissance, and here you've got, he did a lot of depictions of the Annunciation with this kind of scene of Mary and the angel Gabriel. But here, in addition to that, he's got Adam and Eve being cast out from the garden. And, just there, and here, he's emphasizing the angel. There's always all the different things to reverse. You've got the first man and the first woman going bad. Now you've got the first new woman choosing rightly. Here you've got an angel bringing good news. There you've got an angel bringing bad news. Get out. At the bottom, you've got little scenes from the life of Mary. But the central one is the Annunciation, because that's where the reversal of Adam and Eve is most obvious. And so there's God the Father. The light is often used to express the Holy Spirit, and there's a little dove. There's another Annunciation scene, and you might just think, well, it's just, Annunciation scene. But if you look up in the corner, there's Adam and Eve, and, serpent tempting. So another way that one of the themes we talk about when we talk about the crucifixion is the way the tree of life in Genesis gets seen as a type of the cross, the true tree of life. Now, in Genesis, there's actually two trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. But in some of these depictions, they all get kind of merged into one tree. So here you've got Eve and Adam. There's the snake, and they're the eating and causing all kinds of problems. And then there's Mary receiving the blood in a chalice, the new Eve, and then the blessed with her, sharing life from the cross. This one, a really beautiful depiction from a missal of the Archbishop of Salzburg in the 1400s. So this is just a page in a book for celebrating the Eucharist, Mass. And here again, you've got the two trees of life and knowledge of good and evil merged into one. And it is at the same time the tree that Eve eats from. So she's plucking fruit from one side. There's a skull telling you it's leading to death. And there's this kind of grim figure representing the death caused by that sin. There's Adam clutching his head. On the other side, there's Mary plucking a communion host from the tree. And there's the crucifix, because this is the tree of life. And she is giving people communion, the fruit of the tree of life. This is a very recent image from an American cloistered nun. She did this with just colored pencil and ink. And it's titled Mary and Eve. So here's Eve with a snake around her foot. And, Mary is comforting Eve, putting her hand on her pregnant belly. And then also Mary is quietly stomping on the head of the snake. This is shifting a little bit. This is the burning bush. Talked about how the burning bush is a type of Mary. So here is Mary with Jesus in the middle of a burning bush, just to make it easy for you to interpret the symbol. And there's Moses taking off his shoes because he's on holy ground when he approaches the burning bush. Now, another important image or type of Mary in Christian tradition is, so there's Mary as a new Eve. We talked about some of those other types. Another one is Mary as a type of the church, that Mary in herself is a symbol of the church. This one is harder to find examples of in art, but this one church here in Rome, there's a mosaic in the back. This is the Church of Santa Maria Trastevere, which itself, as the basic structure, goes back 400s, 500s. But this mosaic is more recent, around 1290. And you've got Mary and Jesus enthroned in the middle, and various saints along the side. Now, where you know that something different is going on is that Mary is holding a scroll, and so is Jesus. And they're in Latin, we can't read it from here, but Mary's scroll is a quotation from the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament, which is basically a love poem, which has a few little lines that indicate that the woman in the story represents all of Israel. Early Christians, and medieval Christians especially, read this as an analogy between the relationship between Christ and the church, or Christ and the individual soul. And it's also interpreted in Christian tradition as representing Christ and Mary. Now, and so Mary is holding a quote from the Song of Songs. Now this, can be it's very strange. So you've got a love poem where Christ is the man and Mary is the woman. But this is, in the Christian imagination, the way that typing works is you see a type, but you don't take all of the full context. You take some aspects of it. And because Mary is all pure, all holy, and because she represents the church, in the sense of she's a woman, the church is described in feminine terms as the bride of Christ. So Mary can, for that reason, be seen as a fulfillment of the Song of Songs. Not a one-for-one fulfillment, but an important fulfillment. So Mary's got that scroll, and then Jesus has a scroll, something to the effect of, come take this place of honor, which comes from a Christian work as words that Christ says when Mary enters heaven and he greets his mother and says, come sit here. In Jewish tradition, in the Old Testament, the Queen Mother holds a special role in the Jewish court and sits at the right hand of the king, not his wife, his mother. And so here you've got Christ and the Queen Mother next to him. And now all of that symbolism and blurring of lines between bride and mother, Song of Songs and the New Testament, this is all an expression of this ancient Christian tradition of seeing Mary as a type of the church, holy and spotless, and thus a sign of what the church is in its inmost reality, and what the church will be finally, completely in heaven at the end of time. Okay. So now we turn to one particular famous image of the Annunciation by Robert Campen. This Annunciation, so it's either 1300s or 1400s, Flemish, and it's a beautiful painting, but it's fascinating because the amount of very detailed symbols that are put into the image. So here's the pivotal scene. There's Gabriel coming to tell Mary she's going to be the mother of God. And if we could have a close-up, we'd see, if you focus in on her eyes, Mary, it's the moment like he's just come in. And Mary's kind of looking from her book and what is going on? You can see her eyes are just kind of looking out the corner. And the wind, which is in both Latin and Greek, wind, same word for spirit, has blown out the candle. It's just been snuffed out. And from the window, very faintly, you can see golden light coming down. And over here, there's a little baby boy with a cross coming down from heaven. And on the table, you've got lilies. So lilies would often be used to represent Mary's purity and holiness. But you've got 3 flowers, Trinity. And one of them is still a bud, Christ about to come and open up. There's lots of little details that people spend a lot of time, thinking about. So, for example, the table has 16 sides. Now, if you're an artist and you take a table and you put in 16 sides, and you're already kind of filling it with symbols, it makes you think, okay, what does that symbolize? Well, some say it symbolizes 16 prophets of the Old Testament. It's a little close-up. Now, to the right is St. Joseph in his little carpenter shop. And, he's got various tools that allude in some way to the cross. I mean, nails, you've got a hammer. You also have pliers. Now, pliers, I'm not sure when exactly it becomes a common symbol, but pliers about removing nails. So either as just about after the cross you take down the body, you need the pliers. Or also in some traditions it can symbolize, that humans have a choice. They can either contribute to hammering in the nails, or they can remove the nails with a plier. But what is most clear symbol is this, which is a mousetrap, which in patristic early Christian imagery was used to describe how the cross was a trap for the devil. That just as a mousetrap lures a mouse in, and then, with bait, and then the mouse gets captured, so too Christ gives his flesh as bait to evil and the devil, which then, after his death in the resurrection, turns things around and brings good from evil. And so, in this imagery of the mousetrap, Christ's flesh is the bait that gets the mouse to come. And there's another mousetrap on the sill in case you missed the other mousetrap. And then to the side, these are the donors, those who paid for the painting. They got themselves put in the picture. Okay. So now we're going to just look at some of the, there's so many images of Mary that we could look at, but we'll look at a few that stand out for one reason or another. Okay, so here, this is an early icon of Mary, dates to 500s, preserved in the monastery of St. Catherine's in Sinai. Later, all these icons are destroyed for religious reasons, but this one survives because it's so out of the way. And you've got Mary with Jesus in her lap. She's flanked by 2 saints, Theodore and George. Behind her, there are 2 angels looking up, and then a hand, the Father's hand, in blessing. And we're starting to see a trend. Some of those early images of Mary, they're in a narrative context. They're telling a story about Mary that in some way elevates her or just tells the story of Christ and her place in it. But it's starting to have more and more art that's function is to somehow make these holy figures present to the viewer. So the idea is that this ends up being a kind of window into a higher reality. That although it's just, color and pigment, it's actually a window into what's really going on in heaven with Mary and the saints looking at us as we look at these images. And this, this image where you've got Mary in this seated position, ends up being known as Mary, seat of wisdom, where Mary is the throne that Jesus sits on. So this is from an early church, the 600s, 700s, where Mary is surrounded by angels and saints, with her son enthroned on her lap. This is medieval Italian, late 1200s. It's Italian, but it's also influenced by Byzantine, Eastern styles. And here there's a very kind of elaborate throne that Mary is sitting on, which emphasizes how she herself is a throne for her son. This is one of the side chapels, a more recent one, in Santa Maria Maggiore, that early Roman church. And in the back, there is a famous image of Mary called the Salus Populi Romani, Mary, health or salvation of the Roman people. Dates to 600s, 700s, and it's been venerated in Rome for all that time. And there's a tradition with many of these icons of Mary and Jesus that an early legend, maybe the 500s, 600s, that they were actually painted by St. Luke. There's a legend that develops that St. Luke was a painter. And this is one of the early icons that is claimed to have been legendarily painted by St. Luke from life. This is one of the most famous icons of Mary of this kind of style, Our Lady of Vladimir, which was almost certainly, though it's associated with Russia, the city of Vladimir, almost certainly painted in Constantinople, perhaps by the court artists, who then it was given as a gift to somewhere in Eastern Europe or modern-day Russia. And this is a standard kind of depiction of where you've got Mary holding the child Jesus, and he's kind of snuggling up to her, looking at her, while Mary looks out at the viewer with both an expression of tenderness but also sorrow, looking ahead to his death on the cross. And this is universally acknowledged to be one of the most beautiful depictions of Mary in 20 centuries. And what's really remarkable about it is, so much, it's so damaged, it's not in the best condition. And yet, especially her eyes and the face of Jesus. I mean, it's a very stylized kind of depiction. This is not lifelike. And yet, the look in Mary's eyes conveys so much emotion. So this is now Raphael, the Madonna of the Grand Duke. Raphael is known for painting many images of Mary, similar in this in one way or another. It's Mary and a child Jesus, but this is a distinctively Renaissance version of this, where it's very lifelike, three-dimensional, humanistic, this is one of the great Renaissance paintings of Mary. But I think it's interesting to compare this with the Our Lady of Vladimir and say, which of these two, to ask the question, both phenomenal works of art, but which is the one that kind of reaches out to the viewer more than the other and that connects on a deeper level? And I would say this one, but others might choose the other. But either way, it's not an easy question to answer. And it's one of the ways in which the issue of, is a humanistic, more realistic depiction the most kind of effective, even emotionally, kind of Christian art? This is from the Isenheim Altarpiece, we've seen now various images from that altarpiece filling out. Yes? Yes. 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 No, it does look like there's lots of stories in her eyes. Yes. 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 So we've already seen various images from the Isenheim Altarpiece. This is a big altarpiece. You can unfold it for different feast days. And, the outer one, the standard position is the crucifixion. The very inside was Temptations of St. Anthony. But for Christmas, this is what you open it to. So this is the Nativity. There's Mary holding Jesus. It's no particular moment in the story. It's just mother and child. It's kind of a glorious day outside. Then over here, you've got angels performing music, just to, give some background music to it all. And here, you have even the devil playing music. It's like he can't help himself. In spite of himself, he's even amazed that God has become man. So now we're shifting to Sicily, to the cathedral in Cefalù. And this cathedral is especially known for this image of Christ in the back. But underneath, there's also Mary and the saints. And here, I want to see this image of, this is the lower part, just different coloring, you have Mary in this position of prayer, in the orant position, her hands out in prayer. And that's another theme, because so many of these images of Mary are either the Annunciation, where Jesus is present implicitly, or he's about to be present. There's all these images of Mary with the child Jesus. But you also do have images where it's just Mary alone. And often when Mary is alone, she's in a position of prayer. Not in a position of, calling for veneration of any kind, but a position of prayer. She herself is a prayer. There's another image like that. Although this time Mary is the central figure in the apse. And this is another one of the most famous images of Mary, Our Lady of Guadalupe, which dates to the 1500s in Mexico. Now, there's its origins, so you say, are disputed. The story, widely accepted by Catholics, is that there was a Native American Catholic convert, Juan Diego, Saint Juan Diego. And he ends up, it's a long story. If you want the whole story, you can look up Our Lady of Guadalupe and you can read the story. But he has a cactus fiber cloak on. And at one point, he fills it with roses at the instructions of this beautiful woman. And then he goes to the bishop as proof that this beautiful woman told him to have a church built on this particular hill. And he says, here are roses as proof that this beautiful woman asked for it. And he drops his cloak filled with all these roses, and the bishop and the others are astounded, and he thinks it's because of the roses, but it's because this image has appeared on his cactus fiber tilma. That's the story. What we can say is, first of all, parts of this image were clearly painted on afterwards. They're not all from the same. So a lot of the parts that are faded in the back, this little angel, these were added at some later period. So there's multiple different kinds of images. Central image is apparently baffling to explain where it comes from. But in any case, this image of Mary here, this is garb typical of an Aztec princess in Mexico at that time. The kinds of clothes she's wearing, and she has around her waist a kind of ribbon, which was a kind of something that Aztec women would wear when they were pregnant. And her hands are folded in prayer, indication she is a prayer, not someone who calls for veneration or worship. Anyways, this image of Mary is hugely important to Christians in Latin America and South America, especially in Mexico, and even Protestant Christians in these areas, even though there's sensitivity about Mary's role, that Protestant Christians in Mexico will typically venerate Mary under this image because it's so important to Mexican culture. Close up of the face. What's that? Well, what about the bottom? Oh, it was an angel added at some later time. This is a painting by a Russian artist from the early 20th century. And a little background to understand this, where the background of the image is, it started in the early 1800s, a depiction of Mary developed, perhaps influenced by Western depictions of Mary with 7 swords in her heart, and which is a traditional Western and especially Catholic depiction of Mary of having 7 sorrows represented by swords that pierce her heart. It's a reference to what she's told when Jesus is a baby, that her heart will be, a sword will pierce her heart. Well, in Russian art in the early 1800s, they started to depict in Russian icons Mary with a heart and 7 swords in it. But it has an interesting title. In Catholic circles, that would be called, for example, Our Lady of Sorrows. But in Russian tradition, that is called Our Lady, Softener of Evil Hearts. That somehow her acceptance of sorrow softens evil hearts. So this depiction is playing on it. It doesn't have the heart with the swords. But we see Mary with child in the background, a kind of more happy moment. And then over here, the cross, the sorrow, and Mary's face in a hard to exactly, very kind of loaded expression. Hard to say exactly what it's expressing. And the artist gave it a slight variation on the title. Our Lady of Tenderness towards those with evil hearts. So, this was painted around 1914, 1915, right on the verge of World War I. And all of that might be also part of what this painting is expressing. So I'm going to stop there and now shift to Communion of Saints. So in the Apostles' Creed, which is one of the earliest creeds, Christian creeds, which grew out of baptismal formulas when people were baptized. It's called the Apostles' Creed, but it doesn't go back to the apostles. It's some parts of it might, but it takes its form that we know it around 400 AD. And there's one line which we know is added a bit later. Not sure exactly when, but later than some of the other parts of the creed, is it says, I believe in the communion of saints. In the Latin, this is communio sanctorum. And this phrase is ambiguous, what it means. It can mean 2 things in the Latin. It can mean communion of saints, meaning people, or holy people, or it can mean communion of holy things, referring to the sacraments, Eucharist, and so on. And both interpretations fit Christian doctrine, Christian belief, but there's historical debates of what did people mean when they put it in the creed. To my surprise, I thought, this is something that I've been doing research on, and a graduate student in the United States has been doing research on. I thought, my suspicion was that that this was going to be more about communion of holy things. But this graduate student in her research has compelling reasons to think from the beginning it was about communion of holy people. But the important thing for our purposes, whatever it originally meant in the creed, this idea of communion of saints or communion of holy things and holy people is a very ancient Christian idea. And that these things are connected. The people and the things, the holy things, and especially the sharing of common worship and common celebration of receiving the body of Christ. Whether, from a Protestant view, this can be purely a symbol, but for Catholics and Eastern Christians and some Protestants, it is actually the body of Christ. But either way, in the early Christian imagination, these things are linked. That this holy men and women are linked to each other because they're linked to Christian rituals and to Christian symbols. In the New Testament, there's references to clouds of witnesses surrounded by holy men and women from the past. And also in the book of Revelation, speaking about the saints, not just of the Old Testament times, but of the early Christian martyrs and those who have already passed on to heaven before the throne of God. And this vivid idea of a kind of connection, a presence, at least a co-presence, is very much part of just the New Testament witness about early Christian beliefs. It gets more divided among Christians about, well, what more can be said? And whatever is understood about the Eucharist, for the early Christians, connect these things. However that's understood, that there's some connection. And then there is also the disputed question of, is there an ongoing connection so that those who are dead in this life but alive in the Lord can be asked to pray and intercede for the living? Okay, so one thing in the tradition, especially as it's developed in the Catholic and Eastern tradition, that sacramental connection is very important. This is the Altarpiece of Ghent, 1300s in the Netherlands. And up here you've got Mary, God the Father, or Jesus. It's disputed. It's not, art historians aren't sure who's being depicted here. John the Baptist. And here you've got a lamb on an altar, a sign of Christian worship, of Christians gathering to worship the Lamb and receive either actually or symbolically his body and blood. And then saints gathered around at more of a distance, praying. But what this image expresses is a union among the saints centered in worship, and especially the Eucharist. I'm going to skip through some of these other images related to that aspect and shift to some of the saints. Now, I thought in choosing, there's so many saints that we could choose to look at depictions. And so I deliberately chose kind of fun saints to look at with very interesting artistic traditions and legends associated with them. So for the earliest Christians, the most important saints, besides those mentioned in the New Testament, were the martyrs, those who died for their faith. It wasn't until the 300s, 400s, that saints who died a natural death were honored in liturgies, besides those mentioned in the New Testament. And so these are depictions of Saint Lucy, an early Christian martyr who was killed in a persecution around 300 AD in the town in Sicily of Syracuse. And there's really very little that we know historically about her in terms of we can say with much certainty, other than that she was a woman who was killed around this time in the city of Syracuse. We also know that her name, Lucy or Lucia, comes from the word for light. Also, if there's anything about her story that the different early sources agree on, is that she was turned over to the Roman governor as a Christian by a jilted suitor who was scorned. And he wasn't Christian himself, and as revenge, he turned her in as a Christian. And then lots of stories have developed based on these various elements that we have. So one part of the story, again, there's so much are just kind of legends that kind of grew over the centuries, as with many stories of saints, is that Lucy's mother was sick, and they ended up going to pray at the tomb of another woman martyr from Sicily, St. Agatha, who had been killed in the nearby town of Catania 60 years before. And so they go to pray there. Lucy's mother's husband had already died. She's a widow. And they pray there, and she's healed at the tomb of St. Agatha. And they're so grateful and thankful. Although they were people of means, they decide to give away all of their money to the poor. And so here is Lucy and her mother giving away their money to the poor and the needy. And meanwhile, though, a little before this, the mother, kind of concerned, Lucy, to make sure that she'd be set in life, had arranged a marriage to someone. And now her dowry is being given away. And she, meanwhile, has decided to give herself completely to Christ. She doesn't want to be married. And so the suitor hears about this, and he turns her in to the Roman governor. And, and the Roman governor says, I hear you're a Christian. Prove that it's not true by worshiping the Roman emperor. And she refuses. So in order to punish her for this, he decides not just to have her killed, but first, because she had given herself to Christ, to kind of violate that, he wants to send her to a brothel to be violated. But the problem is, they can't move her. And so they get all these oxen to try to move her to the brothel, but miraculously, she can't be moved. And here's another depiction of that. All of them trying to move her to the brothel, but she can't be moved. God is protecting her. So they said, well, I guess we're just going to have to kill her. And the first thing they do is they put her in fire, and to torture her, they throw hot pitch and oil on her. Some of these stories about martyrs can be very elaborate about all the things they do, and without it working. But all that doesn't work either. So finally, they stab her in the throat. But she's still not dead. And so, because before she dies, she wants to receive communion. So she stays alive until a priest comes to give her communion, and then she dies. And so that's with the image of the saints, some of them will be narratives about the stories of the saints, and then some of them are more devotional, kind of those windows into the next life where the viewer is connected with the saints. And so here is Lucy, and the saints will often be depicted with different objects, so that if you were illiterate or you didn't know the story of where this painting came from, you'd be able to know, oh, I know what saint that is. And so what you see here is a sword, and one of the ways they tried to kill her was with a sword. So this is Lucy, you get associated with carrying a sword. And this is some kind of bowl with fire or light, because her name means light. She's depicted with a torch or a bowl of fire to represent the light. So here's another image of that, Lucy with a little cup filled with fire. Often, because martyrs will hold palm branches, a sign of victory. Now, in the late Middle Ages, another tradition gets added to the stories about Lucy. So her name means light, and there would be traditions of praying to different saints according to something that somehow fit their life story and what somebody needed. And so her name means light. So people start to say, well, I guess she's a good person to ask for prayers when you have problems with your eyes and you can't see. And so that seems to have started. And then, in the late Middle Ages, another element of the tortures of St. Lucy gets added, is that in addition to those other things, they decide to gouge out her eyes as part of things. So Lucy will often be depicted with eyes. So there she is holding a little stem with her eyes. Even Lucy thinks it's kind of weird, the way she's kind of, holding and looking. And she's holding a palm branch. Another way that she also gets depicted holding a little plate with eyes. So there's the knife in her throat, and she's holding a little plate with eyes. Now, there are actually multiple stories of where the eyes came from. One story is that as a way to torture her, they gouge out her eyes. But another story is an unwanted suitor tells her how beautiful she is, and particularly how beautiful her eyes are. She says, oh, you think my eyes are beautiful? She pulls them out and puts them on a plate and gives them to him. Actually, one of the reasons why I picked Lucy is because I've got a special attachment to Lucy because on my father's side, I'm Sicilian. And my Sicilian grandmother, who lived in Sicily until she was 35 and came to the United States, who never learned English that well, when I was about 6 years old, she gave me a little prayer card to St. Lucy with a prayer written on Italian on the back, which was of no use to me. And she, in broken English, explained to me how the story of Lucy's boyfriend, telling her she had beautiful eyes and pulling out the eyes and putting them on a plate, and therefore I should pray to St. Lucy for my eyes. I was 6 or 7 years old. I didn't quite know what to make of the story, but I remembered it. And one last thing, just to show you, there's one of the most famous depictions of a saint's life are Giotto's depictions of the life of St. Francis. And there are beautiful series of frescoes that were done in Assisi, the hometown of St. Francis, in a new basilica, that weren't just kind of a wonderful example of a narrative of the life of a saint, but also just a huge advance in the history of art. Giotto is often called the first modern painter. And a lot of that came out as he's working on ways to tell the story of St. Francis, a story that had never been told before in that much detail in art. So he didn't have things to lean on. He had to come up with the images, the stories, how to depict them. So I won't look at them here, we don't have time, but those are something you can search online and you can see them online. But I did want to show you this. This is the earliest depiction of St. Francis, which was painted within 6 years of his death. St. Francis in his lifetime was recognized as extraordinarily holy and was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church very quickly, within a year or two of his death. And so 6 years later, in living memory, people still remembered what he looked like. This image was painted. And you see how, in many ways, this is, although at the time he was dead, this is very much in the tradition of the way the earlier saints had been depicted, as a kind of window to show you somebody living in the Lord who sees us more real than we see him. So I think I will end here. Thank you for being with me in these lectures.